So, welcome to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay, and today my guest is Paul Holman, who's sitting at the moment in Australia, 11-hour time difference. So, for him, it's time to go to bed, and for us, it's morning. So, hi, Paul.
Hello, Iain.
And Paul has written a book called Living Space, Openness and Freedom through Spatial Awareness, which I was sent by his publisher, and I thought, that looks interesting. We haven't done anything specifically about spatial awareness before. So here is Paul, and we're going to have a good chat, and we're going to find out about his life and how he got to this point. And I think I'm correct in saying that you're a doctor and a psychiatrist. Is that correct?
Correct, Iain. Yes, I've been a shrink for well over 40 years.
Yeah, and you're still practicing sometimes, I think, aren't you?
I am, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So we'll proceed and see how we get on. So
Sure.
the first thing I was going to ask you, Paul, was when we talked on the phone the other day, you were saying that you had this aunt who, when you were in your early teens, she actually gave you some books by Gurdjieff and Ramana Maharshi, which is quite a thing when you're that kind of age, especially Gurdjieff, which is quite a dense read. So what kind of effect did those books have on you?
Well, I think that, from quite an early age, I had a very acute sense of death, not because anybody in the family had died, but just I was, at the age of 7, I remember waking up one night completely terrified because I realized that everybody died. And I think that just led me to look for ways around the idea of death. And I remember reading Marcus Aurelius at an early age and sort of finding that kind of stoic approach appealing. But then when I read Ramana Maharshi, or more strictly Paul Brunton's account of Ramana Maharshi in his Search and Secret India, I was immediately convinced that this is somebody who could help me. And the idea of inquiry into who or what you are was the, I think, essential teaching that appealed to me. Here's the key. You inquire about who or what you are. And that's never left me. I think it's a compass. You're never far from getting back on track if you're inquiring in an open way as to who you are, whether you're inquiring about your thoughts, your feelings, and your awareness. So that was a great service to me, learning that this man, Ramana Maharshi, existed and that he communicated this very simple truth of inquiry.
But that's quite something to start in your early teens, isn't it?
It is, and I am profoundly grateful to my dear aunt, who had been a Gurdjieffian for many, many years. And although some of the Gurdjieff books were also left for perusal, I mean, yeah, they're a hard read, but completely intriguing, of course, extraordinary. And yet I subsequently was in a G group in London, but that's for later in the story. And at that time also I read this extraordinary book by two British psychologists, Clare and W.M.S. Russell, who had written a book about human behavior. And it had a very, very illuminating effect for me on what was happening in my family and some of the difficult circumstances in my family. And that was the other thing in my teens that really, I think, helped me stay on track. I really understood something about human dynamics and the sort of roles we get forced to play through family systems. So those were great advantages to have when you're in your teens, especially when you're a kind of anxious introvert and an only child, you know, as I was.
Yeah. And you also told me that you heard this voice when you were only 12 years old that had a
Yes.
really significant effect on you.
Yes. I awoke one day when I was 12, and again, it's one of those memories that are very, very clear, and heard a very distinct voice, not my thoughts. I couldn't say whether it was a man or a woman, saying, and hoped Purusha would come down and settle the ugly mob. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know who Purusha was until many years later. Purusha being the divine person or consciousness or the spirit. But it struck me as what I would say now, in a transcendental way. It was utterly out of this world.
And so, what effect did it have on you in terms of practically?
Look, Iain, I would be hard pressed to say now what effect it had on me practically, that voice. But it was like, when I look back, it was the spirit saying, well, the spirit can come down and intervene. And I mean, maybe the spirit did come down and intervene, and I got the books.
Yes.
And those were the things that guided me.
So it was part of the process somehow, and
somehow part of the process.
Yeah. And then you went to Cambridge University and you studied medicine.
Yeah.
And again, you were saying to me earlier that the best thing about it there was that there was a Buddhist society and there was a Gurdjieff group. So again, you could continue your spiritual studies even though you were studying medicine, which is obviously quite a different thing.
Indeed. Actually, I didn't participate in the G group that seemed to be meeting in Cambridge, but the Buddhist Society was quite different. And that was my first introduction to formal meditation, which I found very difficult and just couldn't persist with. But I knew there was something there. Maybe it helped me somewhat. I mean, I found Cambridge a horrible place. I suffered with a great deal of anxiety and couldn't wait to get out of the place. But I think finding some kindred spirits was helpful. Unfortunately, we only did 3 years of medical science at Cambridge. Then we went down to London to do our clinical part for the next 3 years. And that was a great relief because it was like coming out of this rarefied, strange atmosphere into reality. And the excitement of London in the 1970s for anybody who was a spiritual seeker or wanting any sort of personal growth.
Yeah, I think it was there you met someone called Lawrence Birchall, who was involved with Idris Shah.
I have met Lawrence, actually he was in the north of England, and I met him through a fellow student at Cambridge. But I met Lawrence Birchall in the 70s and got involved with Shah. I did a 40-day Eureka training, did a bioenergetics training with a woman called Gerda Boyesen. That was very, very enlightening. Again, as a sort of rather uptight introvert, it's wonderful to sort of be shoved into the bioenergetic scene, the neo-Reichian scene of really getting into the body, getting into energy, getting into breathing, getting into expression, and getting into quite intense group dynamics, which were terrific for me. So, yes, I mean, there were extraordinary number of things going on in London in the 70s, and I participated in quite as many as I could. But I have to say, looking back, like people in their 20s, particularly young men in their 20s, I was looking for experiences, not understanding. And by the time I got to 30, I was starting to get over it, i.e. the spiritual supermarket and looking for experiences and excitement and revelations and, you know, lights and transcendental experiences.
But it opens you up, doesn't it? Because I was
Yeah.
also involved in that scene in the 70s,
Yeah.
and it was encounter groups and all kinds of things
Yeah.
that at the
Yeah.
time just seemed very, very radical, and you could
Mhm.
you could be yourself to a degree which you couldn't in the
Yes.
outside world.
Yeah.
You were given permission to
Yeah.
say things and act out things,
Yeah.
and that just seems so important at the time. I think it probably still is.
Absolutely. And yet that was the freeing part of it. And the other aspect, which I think we talked about the other day, which was that you realize you're no different from anybody else with your hang-ups and your crazy ideas and your fantasies. And that's extremely liberating. You know, you realize I'm not particularly neurotic. Everybody's neurotic. And that's terrific, you know.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Everybody needs therapy in one way, whether they know it or not.
Yeah, everybody needs it, or nobody needs it, you know.
But how did what you were doing fit in with your conventional training to be a psychiatrist?
Well, I don't know. Luckily, I was in a very liberal department. It was at King's College Hospital down in southeast London. And I had some great bosses. I had some great consultants in our department who were training us. Very open-minded people who were willing to embrace some new ideas, even though they were all pretty conventional psychoanalysts. Excuse me, one moment. So, but I mean, look, yes, it was the difference between the left brain and the right brain. I had to do left brain work to pass my exams, but the whole spiritual and personal growth trip was, yes, a very right brain or whole brained activity. But I seemed to manage to keep them together in some way, and you know, going to the pub helped quite a lot as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I know one thing we talked about, which we don't have to go into detail, but I think it's important to just to mention, is that you got quite disillusioned with spiritual teachers.
Yeah. By the end of my 20s, I'd been following two spiritual teachers in particular. I carried on following one when I came to Australia in my early 30s. But I had seen I had too many bad experiences with gurus or spiritual teachers or group leaders. And I became disillusioned with the whole idea of finding a teacher, finding a guru. And increasingly was persuaded to, you know, follow that idea of being a light unto yourself, following your own authority, at least for a while. And so, I mean, I came to Australia in my early 30s when I met my wife, who was Australian. And I kind of dropped the whole seeking in that respect for a while, and became intensely interested in nutritional medicine, but slipped into another search, which was the search for perfect health through nutrition. Again, something that was promised back in the 70s and 80s by certain charismatic authors. Again, of course, that proved to be a mirage, but I learned some interesting things along the way, and found that nutrition could sometimes do miraculous things.
Yeah.
Even for people who were psychotically unwell. So that was a revelation to me, and I got a lot of good experiences in that way in the 80s.
I just wanted to jump back because I just think it's something that is just worth briefly exploring this, because of my own experience as well with spiritual teachers. It's if sometimes you have to give your power away to find it again. At the end of the day, and you've talked about being your own authority, which is ultimately very important, yes. But of course, there's a whole learning process that goes through that, and to be your own authority from a base of neurosis isn't very helpful either.
Yeah, sure.
And Renata and I are just watching this TV series on Sky at the moment. It's about it's called The Vow, V-O-W, and I don't know if they have it in Australia, but it's about he's a kind of spiritual teacher, growth teacher called Keith Raniere, and you can see at times his brilliance when he talks, but then underneath there's a whole series of actions that come out of his own unclarity, and he's now in prison. 120 years he got sentenced in prison for all kinds of things. There's a brilliance and there's a darkness. There's a light and a darkness, if you like, and it's something that I feel we have to engage with, and we have to navigate our own path. And yes, you have to be aware, you have to be intelligent, and you have to take risks at times, but there is a way through and there is a way out. But yes, being your own authority from an intelligent base is the ultimate game at that level, if you like. And I know you realise that, which is a very important realisation that's it's not addressed by a lot of people.
Absolutely. And I know exactly what you mean by, sometimes, I mean, look, you have to go through that whole process of submitting to a teacher and sometimes getting disillusioned to find your own self and your own authority. And I mean, I realized that obviously some of these teachers, they didn't even have basic human values. Usually it was men with a wonderful line in chat, a wonderful intellectual grasp, no doubt some extraordinary experiences and insights, but some of the values they hadn't even got to, preschool on.
Yes, yeah.
And that's frightening. And frightening when you see people who you know and like getting sucked into that whole maelstrom and not finding their way out again.
Yeah, no, I know that well from people I know. Anyway, you moved to Australia, and the first thing that hit you was space. Yes.
This is the extraordinary thing about arriving in Sydney. We didn't stay in Sydney for very long, but there was this, and then motoring down from Sydney to Melbourne, I just couldn't believe that there was this endless space where you would just travel for hundreds of k's and not see very much. And the bright blue, wide Australian sky. I mean, it's, I can see how the early settlers were often overwhelmed by the experience of Australia. It's kind of overwhelming in one sense and liberating in another. And particularly back then in the 80s, Australia was prosperous and it was pretty free and easy. So there was a spaciousness in the way people behave with one another, in matters of social mobility, and there was a great sort of efflorescence in Australia's intellectual life in the 80s. I mean, there hadn't been much going on before then, in many ways, and Australia's intellectuals had all gone to London to express themselves. Clive James being, of course, the most notable one. But in the 80s, it started to change. So, yes, there was a sense of freedom and liberation and possibility.
And you met this guy called Les Femi, I think if I pronounced it right. had quite an impact?
I've never met Les actually, but what happened
It's
was
his work, wasn't it, had an effect on you?
it was his work.
Yeah.
He was in the 80s. I came across the late 80s and early 90s. I came across 4 authors with remarkable tales to tell. They are all people who found a path on their own authority. And they made a big impact on me. And one of the things I wanted to do in writing the book was to draw people's attention to some of these extraordinary authors who some of whom seem to have been completely forgotten, but had these extraordinary messages about how attention works. And that's the real nub of the matter. And the first person I came across was this wonderful English woman, Marion Milner, who was a psychologist who wrote a book published in 1934 called A Life of One's Own. I regard this book as the most significant book on psychology written in the English language in the 20th century. That's a big claim, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book with innumerable original discoveries about psychology in it, which were light years ahead of their time. And Milner was, as I said, she was a psychologist. She set out, like the Buddha, on a search as to what would make her happy. You know, she wasn't taking the Buddha's path. You know, what's the cause of suffering? She wanted to know what made her happy. And she found in her, she's the diary and self-observation method. She found that she would often get these periods of enhanced perception and delight. And she wanted to encourage them, but she didn't know how she got there. So she again observed herself, and she eventually discovered how she could find openness. And it was, in fact, by using what she called at that time, remember this is 1934, wide attention. She would relax and open her attention to her senses. And she realized there were 2 sorts of attention, narrow focus or narrow attention and wide attention. And she said, look, narrow attention is what we're doing most of the time. It's our default position. It's the way we attend to one thing after another, like a narrow torch beam, which is always on the go, always seeking, always being used in the service of our fears and our desires. She has a wonderful term for it. She called it the questing beast. As opposed to wide attention, which we can only mobilize when we're relaxed, when we have no expectations, no judgment, and when we are literally open perceptually and cognitively. And I thought, wow, that's extraordinary. This distinction between narrow and wide attention. No one has ever told me about this. I've never read it in a psychology textbook. I've never seen it in a book on meditation. But there it is. So she was one. The next was a woman called Flora Courtois. Yeah.
Okay, let me stop you there. So how did that affect you? Is that something you understood and you could practice straight away?
Yeah, good question.
Or is it something
That's a very good question.
You
No, I couldn't understand it right away. That was the extraordinary thing. I understood it intellectually, but I didn't understand it in the way of somehow I couldn't practice it, although I knew that this was something that I'd experienced when I had first read Douglas Harding's little book on having no head. And this little book, which I'm going to, my little original copy of Harding's on having no head, and I expect many people who are watching this may be familiar with Harding's work, some may not. But this lovely little book, of course, is about when he was in the Himalayas and he suddenly realized he had no head. And where his head was, the world was. And I realized that Harding had a sudden experience of wide attention, of the incredible three-dimensionality and reality of reality when your attention is wide open. And when I read that book first, I had that experience of suddenly feeling my attention was normally like that, and then it suddenly opened back out. And it was completely, suddenly disorientating to be suddenly flooded with three-dimensional reality. And boom, I snapped back pretty quick. And then subsequently had difficulties remobilizing that sensation. And many years later, I understood that I was trying to get back to that experience in a narrow focus sort of way, not a wide attention way. It took me years. Yeah, go on, sorry.
But this is a really important point though, isn't it? Because this happens to all of us. We have, I'm going to call it experience, it's not the best word, but something happens, something changes our perception, and then we kind of know this is it, and we're kind of excited, and it does last, and it can last seconds, minutes, for some people days, and then of course it goes, and understandably we're so much want it to come again, but of course it's that trying and that effort that's preventing it happening. So that's a very human thing that we all do. But I think the thing to say about Douglas Harding is that, and I think, have you got the little prop with you? You can show us in a minute. Because, okay, let me just say first of all that I went to, years and years ago, I went to a workshop, very small, with maybe 12 people, with Douglas Harding. And I haven't got a clue what he's talking about. It took me years and years and years to get it. And then, of course, I interviewed Richard Lang on Conscious TV in the early days of Conscious TV. And Richard was one of his most enthusiastic proponents. But anyway, why don't you do the exercise that Douglas Harding did? And people that are watching can see, well, do they get it or
here's
not?
Douglas Harding's little book, The Science of the First Person. And you open the book, and there is a pop-out tube. Now, and you put your face in the tube, and if you have another person at the other end of the tube, like Iain, even though you're many miles away, you're at the other end of the tube, and you ask yourself the question, on present evidence, how many people are in the tube? How many faces are in the tube? How many heads are in the tube? And you have to, if you go on your immediate experience, that is your perception, you find, of course, that there's only the other person's face in the tube, not your own. And actually, I find the exercise much easier to do just looking in a mirror. And the problem I found with some of Harding's exercises is that, like this one, is that it tends to narrow your focus. But as you said, Iain, it just takes a long time to understand this idea that you can open attention, and when attention is opened, you have a different experience of reality. By the way, Richard Lang's book on Harding is so delightful. It's just a wonderful book about Harding, and again, a must buy, and it was a very good interview you did with him too.
Yeah, Richard's still working doing sessions and doing seminars. But just to stress again this whole such an important point that these things come sometimes with the grace of God. We have some help with perception, with the wider attention, and then it's a question of, how would you describe it? It's a question of recognition and then relaxing into that recognition. How would what advice would you give?
As a result of reading some other authors, which I can talk about or not, as the case may be, and particularly the American psychologist Les Femi, who has written a book called The Open Focus Mind, which is all about how to use attention. I think that from a practical point of view, you have to start with the idea of spaciousness and the visual appreciation of spaciousness. And when I introduce this idea to people, say my patients, I do this simple exercise with them, which is to say to them, look, just put two fingers in front of you. Look at them very closely. When you look at your fingers very closely, you are using quite a narrow attention. Now I want you to move your fingers to the side, but keep track of both of them at the same time until they disappear from your field of view. Notice what you're experiencing, and then bring them back. Keep them both in view at the same time, and then snap back into narrow attention. We're so accustomed to the idea of narrow attention that most people, when they start doing that, kind of want to look at each finger in turn to keep an eye on them, rather than letting the spaciousness happen, which can accommodate that appearance of both fingers at the same time. And Russell Williams has got a very similar exercise in his book, Not I, Not Other Than I. Again, someone you interviewed, lovely interview on Conscious TV. And he makes the same point. He said, look at an object across the room. Now, there's the object. You can see the object, and here are you. There's no question, is that there you're the subject, and there's the object. Now, just imagine the object and some space around it. And now broaden that space out. And keep broadening that space out until you're aware of the space of the whole room. Now where's the object? Now where's the subject? Nowhere to be seen, just space. And it's a very neat little exercise, but Femi has lots of exercises like this in his book, on his CDs, where you experience space in the body, you experience space perceptually, but also space with all the senses arising simultaneously in space. And it's a very, very powerful method. And again, if one can hold expectancy in abeyance, a very potent way of enhancing perception and this basic sense of space, which is so liberating.
Yeah, and I know someone else that, I don't know if you met them or you read their work, someone called Ainsley Mears.
Yes.
Have I pronounced that right? Yeah. And the message there was very much about learning to relax. Because obviously with a narrow focus is attention.
Yes.
With the wider is more of a relaxation. And that I know that did you actually meet her?
No, I met Ainsley Mears and used to go down to do his sessions and with the rest of the people who came along for his meditation group. And then he would discuss cases with me because I was a doctor and interested in some of the discoveries he'd made in physical as well as psychological health. I mean, Mears was a psychiatrist, became interested in the East, and realized, look, most psychiatric illness, of the non-psychotic kind at least, has at its base anxiety and stress. That's what everyone needs to do. Let's cut through the nonsense of psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. Let's just get people to deeply relax. And then he found that the deep relaxation methods that he was using, of course, helped people with cancer and a whole range of physical problems. And I saw, yeah, sorry, go on, Iain.
Yeah, so, no, it's
Yes.
like this contraction that we have in many different levels in the cells. They obviously cause blockages, and illnesses
Absolutely.
start because of the blockages.
And I think the thing about this distinction between narrow and open attention, or narrow and wide attention, is that narrow attention is very much associated with chronic stress. And it itself is highly stressful. When you're in narrow attention, you're stressed. Stress makes narrow attention worse. Narrow attention makes stress worse. It's a negative feedback cycle. And wide attention requires relaxation, but it's a virtuous circle. The more you open your attention, the more you relaxed you become. The relaxation helps to maintain that openness of attention, and the world comes in. You actually come to your senses. And this is what's so great about the wide attention process. And I would say that we're pretty confident now that wide attention is very much a process under the control of the right hemisphere, or the non-dominant hemisphere, and narrow attention, the left hemisphere. And as Iain McGilchrist has pointed out in his book, The Master and His Emissary, the left hemisphere thinks it runs the show, and it's running the show with narrow focus, but it's getting us into a lot of trouble. Of course, we live in a narrow focus culture now. You've only got to travel on public transport to see all your fellow humans hypnotized in narrow focus by a tiny little machine. Extraordinary, and it's very dangerous. I mean, it's a very dangerous development in human consciousness.
Yeah. So when you're in sessions with your clients, how are you working with them? Because obviously they want to talk, and I know one of the things you also told me before, that the most important thing actually in that kind of session is the ability to listen. And someone that can truly listen offers a healing just in that. But just talk through what might happen in a session in terms of someone coming with psychiatric problems that many people have these days.
Yes, I mean, after many years, when I fully understood I say fully, but when I understood more about the importance of continually opening attention to spaciousness. And attention is, as you said, Iain, it's fundamentally a contractive process in most of us. I understood that it had extraordinary implications for therapy, for healing, as well as understanding meditation and mindfulness. Excuse me. So I really began to see the conventional way of dealing with psychological problems, which is the current way, the broad philosophy now in psychiatry and psychology, which is to look in terms of diagnosis, finding what's wrong, setting goals and targets for specific therapies devoted and aimed at your symptoms or the constellations which cause your symptoms. And that's absolutely in violation, actually, of what most people want. Sure, some people just want a pill and want a solution, that's fine. But actually, most people are looking for a safe place, a safe space where they can be themselves, which is extraordinarily rare. You know, you mentioned earlier the idea of a safe place to be yourself as something which we might have discovered in groups in the 70s. And this idea of a therapist not having any expectations of someone, not judging them, being completely open to what their story is and which way they want to go, I think is the ideal way to work. And the most essential ingredient in that is that the therapist and their client are on absolutely the same human level. There's no hierarchy here. Because I have a psychiatric degree, I have to disabuse clients in subtle ways that, you know, I've got any sort of solution for them other than providing a safe, open, non-judgmental, friendly space where we can take our time and go slow. But of course, taking your time and going slow, that's, again, not a modern way.
And how long does it take to get results? Do you find that certain people start
Some
to
people
get it
do.
straight away?
There are often people who are on a spiritual path and who've done work with themselves. With others, I mean, many people never completely get it. And some people have been so damaged by their lives that they're coming for years. And I still see people who I've seen for the last 25 years. And that's okay too. You know, there are many people who live in horrible circumstances, who've had terrible lives, and their nervous systems have been absolutely fried by trauma and difficulty.
And this process of relaxing the nervous system,
Oh, my word.
that takes
My
time,
word.
doesn't it? Because the nervous system doesn't
No.
heal overnight.
And, you know, some people, the nervous system is damaged irreparably, but that doesn't mean we can't do things. We can't manage the situation. But yes, relaxing the nervous system and creating spaciousness. And the idea, I think, that's central to all healing, and particularly psychotherapy, is getting distance on things. You know, we can't, as the American psychologist Eugene Gendlin says, you can't smell the soup when your face is in it. And we have to get distance from our story, from our feelings, from our difficulties, to step back and to be able to really give them space so that those memories, those difficulties can express themselves and we can see them in context. This all has to do with creating space around our feelings, around our cognitions, and particularly around our senses.
Yeah, in your book there,
Yeah.
you have quotes at the beginning of each chapter, and the quote beginning of the first chapter is, now and then it is good to pause in
Just
our
be
pursuit
happy.
of happiness and just be happy.
Isn't that great? It does.
Still
I
makes
love
you
that
laugh
quote,
after.
Yeah.
I mean,
I love that
Yeah.
quote. That's right. And it's our headlong pursuit into the future, isn't it? That does us in. And that's why, you know, my way of meditating has changed so much over the years. You know, for me now, sitting in the garden and allowing spaciousness to unfold and the sounds and the sights to arise. This for me is all I need to refresh me, really.
Yeah, and it's so interesting the different
Yeah.
approaches to meditation, and we've had so many people obviously in Conscious TV that
Sure.
do are meditators, big meditators, and some of them have gone to like extreme situations to meditate for, and I'm not
Yes.
exaggerating, 12, 14 hours a day in very difficult conditions in terms of cold and discomfort and
Yeah.
sitting through that physical discomfort. And for some that works. It seems to produce a state of enlightenment, freedom,
Sure.
whatever we call it. Doesn't matter what we call it, but it produces something that's extraordinary, and it changes their life. Yet for, I suspect, the majority of people, sitting in that situation actually does more harm than
Sure.
good. It isn't very much an individual thing, but it's
No.
not the best to sit
No.
in pain for hours and hours in cold.
Absolutely,
for
and
your nervous
I agree.
system,
I
is it?
think as much harm is done, certainly, as good by those extreme methods. I mean, some of the extreme methods, as you appreciate, are based on the idea of exhausting narrow focus. Just you're concentrating, the pain, the difficulty is narrowing your focus on the pain, and you're just going through this corridor. And sooner or later, this contraction has to give up by sheer exhaustion, and then bam, something opens up. But it seems a very circuitous way, and often a very, if I may say so, Japanese way of doing it, because the extreme Zen methods seem to top the list with regard to putting people through great difficulty in the name of enlightenment.
Yeah, and it is very much, as I said earlier, a personal thing, and it's up to us to, I guess, keep checking
Absolutely.
in. Is this the right way for me? Because what works for
Yeah.
someone else doesn't necessarily
And
work for me.
sorry, I just make one point. Often people are motivated in spirituality as well as in psychology by this premise that there's something wrong with us. If we can get over the idea of actually there's nothing wrong with you. You've got an anxiety state. Actually, you've got an anxiety state, but there's nothing wrong with you. You're hearing voices. I can understand that's distressing. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not in a state of spiritual darkness. You're all right. You're an okay person. Relax. Enjoy. Open up.
And open up. That's pretty much a key in so many ways. And you also talk in the book about space being the visual
Yes.
equivalent
Yes.
of silence.
And I think the experience of mystics, I think often, in the writings of mystics, you often find that interchangeability of silence and space. You find this in Franklin Merrill Wolff, in his wonderful book, Pathways Through to Space, and his working out of his experiences in the philosophy of consciousness without an object. You find it particularly in Bernadette Roberts' book, The Experience of No Self, which is, just a wonderful, wonderful book. Here's someone who's experienced deep silences from an early age. But the crucial turning point in her spiritual path, which gave way to her ultimate seeing, was what she said was developing 3D glasses, of having this extraordinary experience of space opening up. And the interior silence had kind of given way to a kind of Douglas Harding experience, if I can. I'm sure she would be offended by my saying this, but an openness to a new way of seeing, perception, space.
Yeah, yeah, I've read all those books, and certainly with Franklin Mel Wolfe, I didn't get it to start with. It's kind of Bernadette Roberts was a more interesting read, but on the other hand, I know someone that spent time with her, and she chain smoked, and it kind of you wonder, and it's not to say in a judgmental way, but it's people go through strange paths which are right for them, and one has to somehow accept that, and whatever works for them that's good.
And
yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say a little bit about mindfulness. I don't know if you were going to bring that up, Iain, but the idea of wide attention and opening up to space really solved the mindfulness thing for me, because I've been trying to do mindfulness off and on for years, and it was just too tiring to be in the present, to be concentrating on the present. When I understood about wide attention, opening your focus, then I understood that I'd been trying to do mindfulness with a narrow focus, and it was just exhausting. Just being aware of one thing after another can't be done. And I've wondered since why there isn't more free and immediate discussion in the teaching of mindfulness. That actually, first of all, you've got to stop, of course. Then you've got to relax, breathe, and open your focus to be mindful. You can't start being in the here and now, because that's not an instruction which is helpful for using your attention.
Yeah, I find there's so many dilemmas here, because in a way you need a certain discipline which comes from narrow focus, not only to discipline yourself to meditate or to be mindful, and yet that narrow focus discipline is not really going to take you deeply into being mindful or into meditation, but it's a starting point. And I think it's an individual thing for everybody, that you start with that, and then you have to allow.
I mean, it's interesting that there are precedents, and I mention them in the book, that for starting samatha meditation, for example, obviously traditionally focusing on the breath in a rather narrow focus sort of way, but you can start with focusing on space. And that's your anchor, that's the discipline. You come back to space every time. I presume that that's not a way that's recommended for most people, because I think it's harder. But yes, there's a balance there. And that balance, I think, is also the balance that we have to strike between narrow and open focus in everyday life. And as Femi points out, that we're not advocating one mode of attention at the complete expense of the other. Being aware of how we're using attention and how appropriate it is to the situation we're in, that is true attention training.
Yes, and something else you mentioned too in the book is about the hyperactivity disorder, which again comes from the extremities of the narrow focus. And as you said earlier, with the whole thing with the mobile phones, it's people going in and in and in, narrow, narrow, narrow. And sadly, it's the way society is going, and to have a wider focus is something that is unusual when it should be natural.
Absolutely, and we're becoming an ADD society, attention deficit hyperactivity society, and that's a very frightening prospect, because it means that the right hemisphere is never going to get a look in to give us a big picture. And I mean, it's the right hemisphere which knows about the body, which knows about how the world works, which has intuitions about what we need to do. and which holds our whole body image and sense of self, if it's not getting a look in, there's trouble.
Yeah. So we're going to finish the actual interview in about 5 minutes, and then you're going to do, I think, a short exercise afterwards.
Sure.
How would you like to, your book, which I haven't read the whole thing, but I've dipped in and out, over 300 pages, there's a lot in here. What would you like to say, just triggers for some of the important things that are in the book we haven't covered in this interview so far?
I think the only other thing which we haven't covered is that, and I think as you were implying a minute ago, Iain, spaciousness is also dependent on being very centered. And being extremely centered and being spacious are codependent on one another. And the American author Judith Blackstone, who uses a lot of spacious exercises in her psychotherapy, she points out that the more grounded and centered we are, the more spacious we naturally become. And in spaciousness, we naturally return to a centeredness. And it's a lovely breathing that goes on. Centered, spacious, centered, spacious. So I devote 3 chapters in the book on the 3 dimensions of space, and quite a lot of stuff about how to be centered in those 3 dimensions. And when I do my meditation, I often start by centering myself in the 3 directions: my left and right axis, my front and back axis, and my top and bottom axis. And that puts me in space. That centers me then. There are many other centering exercises which you know all about. And that is very promoting of, now I have my center, and the spaciousness can follow on more naturally from that. And interestingly, the most challenging of the directions is front back. It's easy to visualize your left and your right, your above and your below. But feeling space at your back, that's hard. All the space that's behind you. And that's because we're so frontal. This is, narrow attention has made us completely frontal. And I don't think that would be the natural perceptual modality of, say, a hunter-gatherer who's in their environment. I'm pretty sure they have a much broader sense of space because they have to be aware of everything around them. And the only parallel to that in meditation is the Japanese, the Zen shikantaza, sitting like a mountain, where you're absolutely aware of all the dimensions and what's absolutely happening around you in a very alert and present way.
Good, thank you. All right, we'll close the interview now, and very much appreciate you staying up late, well past your bedtime, I'm sure.
It's been a real pleasure, Iain, and I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
And if people stay with us, you'll do a short meditation after the end of after we close this. And thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all the guys out there who are watching Conscious TV. It's always great you stay with us through the years, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.
So we might do a 5-minute meditation on space, on our sense of space, and on our sense of our body in space. our whole body in space. So I want us first of all to relax, take a deep breath, and relax on the out breath. And feeling the whole body. Feeling the whole body all at once. And feeling that as we breathe out, the whole body relaxes quite naturally and easily on the out breath. Quite naturally and easily on the out breath. And I want you to be aware that you're sitting or lying in a room. And I want you to become aware of the space in that room. And try and become aware of that space all at once. The space of the room. And relaxing on the out breath. And becoming aware of the whole space of the room. And now become aware of all of the space that you feel on the right side. All the space in the room that you feel on your right side. Continue to relax easily and naturally on the out breath. Aware of the space on your right side, filling the room with space. And now becoming aware of all of the space in the room on your left side. And relaxing on the out breath. And feeling that space. Feeling the space. As you feel that space on your left side, feel that your eyes are soft. You're aware of space. You're not looking at anything. Simply aware of space on your left side. And on your right side. And now aware of space on both sides. Aware of space, relaxing into that space. And feel how your body is on the left and the right. And relaxing. And feeling that your eyes are soft, soft and easy. Aware of space on the left and the right. And now feeling space above you. The space above you in the room. And feeling the space below you, in the room. And feeling your body in the space between above and below. And relaxing on the out-breath, naturally and easily. The eyes are soft and easy. Now aware of the space in front of you. And see if you can be aware of the space behind you. The space in the room behind you. Or even the space outside of your room behind you. And relaxing on the out-breath. The eyes soft and easy. The eyes soft and easy. Aware of space above and below, to the front and behind, to the right, to the left, filling your whole body in space. And now, without closing your eyes, just be aware of the space inside your body. Mainly inside your torso, your abdomen, your chest. Feel the space inside. Relaxing on the out-breath. Easily and naturally. Eyes soft and easy. Feel that space inside. Feel the space inside your body. And can you feel that that space inside your body is the same as the space outside your body? The space in the room, the space above and below, to the left and the right, and in the front and behind. Space. And can you feel that that space is very relaxing? It's very easy. It's very natural. And it's good to relax into that spaciousness. The spaciousness outside and the spaciousness inside. Relaxing on the out-breath into that spaciousness. And aware that at any time, when you remember, you can feel that spaciousness outside and inside. And that spaciousness is very good. It's very good to feel that spaciousness. It's very natural. It's very easy. It's very safe to be in that space. A natural space, which is inside and outside and is all one space. Your space and the space of your awareness. And remember, you can feel that at any time when you remember, and feel that ease and relaxation of space. So taking a deep breath, and moving around a little bit. What is in the body? Focus your eyes, look around a little bit. Take another deep breath. Make sure you're in your body. You're not spaced out now. You're in your body. You're able to focus. You know where you are. You know what's happening. And that is the end of our meditation.
So hello and welcome to a brief Conscious TV advert to promote our 2 new books, which are Conversations on Awakening, Part 1 and Part 2. And of course they follow up our first book, which came out about 5 years ago, Conversations on Non-Duality, and then we had Conversations on the Enneagram. And they're all transcripts of interviews that we've done over the years, many of them kindly done by volunteers, and we still have volunteers that are helping with that. If you would like to help, then let us know. I think these 2 are probably, in a way, the most interesting books, the new one, Conversation on Awakening. They're each 12 interviews, a good variety. There's some Renata interviews, there's some interviews done by me. And what we've learned over the years is awakenings and different levels of awakenings happen in so many different ways. Often the real jump can be completely unexpected. Other times the person has worked for years to raise their consciousness, and then something happens. So I won't read you all the people that are on here. If you're interested, you can obviously check out on our website or on Amazon. Or indeed with the publisher. The publisher is called White Crow Books. They have a couple of pages with lots of details on the books. So we have A.H. Almas in part 1, Jessica Britt, Linda Clare, John Butler, Billy Doyle, Cynthia Beaujolais, I'm just picking out a few names, Philip Jacobs, and in part 2,
Cynthia Beaujolais.
Okay.
Beaujolais is a wine, a very nice wine.
So we only have the finest, both in interviews and wines. You see, I don't drink wine, but Renata does, so she knows the finest wines. And then we have Suzanne Marie, is that pronounced correct? Mm-hmm. Yes, very good. Richard Moss, Mukti, Mick Pott, Reggie Ray, Russell Williams, Jürgen Ziva, is that pronounced right? Ziva, okay. Yeah. Martin Wilson and Jar Wobble. That's a great name, isn't it, Jar Wobble? He's a good friend of mine. It's John, who was the bass player in Public Image. Any of you guys who like noisy music out there. Anyway, they all have their own unique stories. They all talk from their hearts, and I think they're all fascinating. And sometimes when you read a transcript, you get something different you don't necessarily get from the interview. Obviously, when you watch the interview, there's also a transmission, but by reading it, it also affects you in a different way. So it would be lovely if you order the books. They're physical, and they're also available as ebooks. And that's all I have to say, really. Do you want to add anything?
No.
No? Okay. So hopefully we'll see you again soon, and hopefully this advert wasn't too intrusive in your life.
Goodbye.